Welcome back to the Ancient Connection. Today we're going to be talking about Alexander the Great. We're not going to be talking about so much what he did, but we're going to answer a question that was posed to me a while ago, and it's a simple one. Was Alexander the Great really that good, or was he just lucky? Let's find out. Alexander the Great remains one of the most sought after and greatest military commanders in history due to his employment of revolutionary developments in both military technology and high-risk personally led tactics to pin and destroy enemy forces. Now, Alexander's success is clearly tempered with his willingness to take extreme personal risk to achieve his military goals, and that begs the question whether or not Alexander was in fact a brilliant strategist or whether or not he was lucky. The reality of Alexander's campaigns against the Greeks, Persians, and Indians, though, highlights that while Alexander took these risks, they were largely calculated and backed with a high level of competent military strategy, intertwining his luck with his skill. Alexander's greatest asset during his military campaign was undoubtedly, though, his inheritance of the highly effective and experienced Macedonian army, and this allowed him to take personal risk as a part of a wider strategy, knowing that if he fell, the army would not disintegrate. Furthermore, the Macedonian army was equipped with revolutionary advances in military technology. They employed massed phalanxes of phalangites armed with sarissas, and supported by units such as the Agriganian skirmishers and heavy cavalry or heteratoi, companions. By utilising the experience and versatility of these forces that he inherited from Philip, Alexander was able to combine his willingness for personal risk and personal glory to lead from the front. And in doing so, Alexander employed wider strategies such as that of the highly effective hammer and anvil strike to decimate these large military formations. Through presence alone on the battlefield, the leader was able to inspire and encourage his men to fight and to follow him into otherwise highly suicidal situations, turning the course of battle, as is highlighted during the siege of Malloy that we will get into later. But when we examine the question though, luck or skill, we've got to note that Alexander is shrouded in myth, not only from his own cult of personality, but also from later writers and the Romans who held him in such high regard. Nevertheless though, the combination of these factors, such as, personal bravery, strategy, and effective leadership, it cements Alexander as one of the greatest military commanders in history. But his success can largely be drawn back to the preparations made by Philip II in how he reformed and built the Macedonian army from a classic Greek hoplite army to what was at the time a highly modern and effective fighting force. Now, I've said this a couple times already, but the key factor in Alexander's success has to be the existence of the Macedonian army, and he did not build it. In particular, the success came from the corps of infantry surrounded in the phalangite known as, in English, the pikemen. It was not Alexander the Great that evolved the Macedonian army into this highly effective force. Rather, it was his father, Philip II, and also his older uncle, also called Alexander, who shifted the Macedonian army away from the traditional Greco-tribal force fighting toward a far more flexible and professional force. Evidence of this kind of change can clearly be seen in the political consciousness of Alexander's infantry corps during his campaigns in Syria, in which Alexander had to resort to threats of diluting the Greek infantry with Iranians. Alexander the Great, along with his predecessors, would face this growing issue of an educated and conscious military throughout their time in power. They would be required to, as stated by Curtius Rufus, to make significant changes from their ancestral practices to keep the army together. They evolved the army, keeping that army educated, but keeping it under the thumb, and that was the fun balancing act that Alexander, Philip, and his other predecessors had to play. To make their army professional, they relied on an educated soldier, but the educated soldier would question orders, so they had to placate that educated soldier through other means. The constant evolution of the Macedonian army in what can be described as then an Alexandrian army, through its recruitment and training of local forces in the Greek way of life and the Macedonian way of life, is indicative that as Alexander marched forward, he did so with the backing of the strong martial force. And due to the martial force's prowess, Alexander could trust his forces under localized commanders such as Parmenion, who commanded the left flank of Gaugamela, to hold even if he wasn't there. And Alexander's ability to rely on these commanders set the conditions for high-risk actions, such as large flanking cavalry charges that took Alexander and the companions away from the core of the army and the core of the battle in order to strategically surround and annihilate the enemy force. This kind of deployment of forces gave the Macedonians a massive tactical advantage through mobility and staying power, and it allowed Alexander to defeat his enemies strategically, even if he went down doing it in the process. Having a professional soldier was worth 10 times more than any peasant with a spear. And a key part of that wider Macedonian military strategy that I alluded to before was the use of armoured shock cavalry, commonly referred to as the companions. The term companion cavalry, though, is a misnomer, as the companions made up a small section of the total cavalry force employed by the Macedonians, and it included multiple other units such as Thessalian cavalry, or just random Sarissa cavalry that weren't as heavily armoured. And it's highlighted by Polybius here, but a key issue with the Macedonian strategy of heavy pike infantry was the risk in which uneven ground played in breaking up the formation of the army, leaving it vulnerable to attack. Now, later on, this would prove fatal to the Macedonians in the Third Macedonian War, because Romans would take advantage of this at the Battle of Pydna to break apart and destroy the phalanx. But Alexander was fully aware of this weakness, and in order to counter the risks to his infantry while crossing uneven ground, he made regular use of Macedonian cavalry to break apart and outflank enemy forces to keep them busy. This is clearly shown by his actions at the Battle of Issus, where Alexander personally led his forces from horseback across the river into the Persian left, shattering it. In contrast, the much more sluggish centre of the Macedonian line, without the support of the manoeuvrable cavalry on horseback, struggled and buckled, but it didn't break because it was a professional force, it was disciplined. It was due to the king's strategy on the Persian left flank that the already victorious forces under his direct command on that flank were able to wheel around and thrust into the Persian centre from the left, which caused a rout and led to victory. Issus therefore can be seen as an example of Alexander employing strategy to overcome battlefield handicaps, to use his forces, but doing so at tremendous personal risk, but calculated risk. So he's not lucky, he's just using strategy to do it. Furthermore, Issus itself highlights the strategic importance of the variety of units under Alexander's command, and it's clear that the king took note of each unit's strengths and weaknesses to dominate the battlefield from a holistic position rather than one as just a general giving orders. He moved with his men to make sure he could get the best view of the battle from his perspectives. And that leads us to Gaugamela. See, the Battle of Gaugamela is often referred to as Alexander the Great's defining moment. It's the battle in which he ascended from merely a competent Macedonian king-general to a legendary figure that's still held in reverence today. The battle itself was a resounding Macedonian victory due to the maneuver employed by Alexander, known as the hammer and anvil. This strategy required Alexander to lead the cavalry itself in a decisive flanking action, while his infantry formed a defensive line to hold the enemy position. The effectiveness of this tactic relied on the flat battlefield at Gaugamela, as uneven terrain would have left gaps in the Macedonian phalanx. As described by the historian Arrian in Anabasis Alexandri, Alexander's cavalry was to strike them in their rear while the infantry kept them engaged in the front. So Alexander's decision to lead the Macedonian cavalry, including the much vaunted companions, was highly dangerous and highly risky because he was completely leaving the centre of his army and the flank of his army under the trust of his generals. But, like I said, it's a professional army, so Alexander was able to trust these generals and their men to execute their roles. And as quoted by Plutarch, Alexander would go on to claim of his generals that, "I trusted you with my army, I expect you to act as though your life depends on it, for it will." This statement highlights the level of intense trust that Alexander put in his forces and his commanders, and it plays a key part in examining the effectiveness and brilliance of the wider strategic moves at Gaugamela, and the willingness to put himself in the position that he may die and fall, knowing full well that the army will likely continue, and that the battle will likely continue and it will not lead to the destruction of the Macedonian force if he falls. Gaugamela itself can be seen as a shining example of Alexander the Great's strategic brilliance and willingness to take that personal risk, but only in a calculated way, taking away that argument that he wasn't purely just lucky, that he was doing it knowing full well it was the right thing to do. But what about that personal risk? Because it wasn't just Gaugamela, it wasn't just Issus. The extent of his luck, though, it wasn't just Gaugamela, it wasn't just Issus. Alexander was, without doubt, pretty lucky in certain events. And the extent of this luck can be clearly highlighted by his decisions at the Battle of Malloy, in which the king, along with 2 companions, climbed a siege ladder ahead of the main enemy army and became trapped in the city. And during the siege itself, Alexander would be wounded by an arrow to the chest, which penetrated his lung and led to a belief that he had been killed. But it didn't shatter the army. The survival of Alexander at Malloy can be seen as an example of his successes being reliant on luck, sure, but what that does not consider is the strength of the Macedonian army and its command structure that had been set in stone. It allowed him to take this risk. This strength is clearly evident when one considers Issus and Gaugamela, like we just spoke about, where Alexander was able to maneuver his slowly moving infantry into position and protect its vulnerabilities with a much more mobile cavalry force. But at Malloy, he was able to do something that directly could have led to his death, very nearly did, but because the army was so well structured, so educated, and so professional, it was completely calculated and fine, even if he did die, that it would not lead to the death of the army. This is not something you can say about the Alexandrian Empire, which on its best was shaky politically from the beginning. It must be further considered, though, just how impactful the presence of Alexander on the battlefield must have been to both friendly and enemy forces, with Arrian being quoted as saying that in the midst of his peril he was a constant figure of courage, leading from the front, inspiring his soldiers with his own unflinching resolve. Alexander's decisions to take personal risk can therefore be described as also a strategic move, to spur on his own forces, while impacting the morale of his enemies in crucial zones of the battlefield, such as with the cavalry at Gaugamela and Issus, or himself in the citadel at Malloy. And that gives us back to the original point. Was Alexander the Great fantastic? Or was he just lucky? I don't think you can really say either of these claims. I think it would be better to say that Alexander the Great was calculating. He knew that he inherited an army that was professional. He knew that he inherited an army that could fight well, it could fight hard, and it could stand on its own 2 feet even if he fell. And because he knew that, and because his military was conscious politically with education, he could trust it. And he could take these risks that required a lot of luck to survive. A single arrow, a single slingshot, a single thrown axe, a single javelin or spear, going in the wrong direction at Malloy or Gaugamela or Issus, and it's all over. Alexander falls, and the conquest does end. Likely whoever succeeds him does sue for peace when it comes to Persia, maybe keeping some of the land in Anatolia, but really just ending it there, and perhaps Persia manages to get its stuff together and go back and take the land back. We don't know, that's counterfactual history. But if, say, Alexander dies on the charge at Gaugamela, Gaugamela is probably not getting lost. In fact, Gaugamela is probably still a win for the Macedonians because the strategy is still in play. Parmenion knows his place, the leader of the cavalry knows their place, the leader of all of the different parts of the Macedonian army know their job. If Alexander dies at Malloy in the citadel, the army still breaks through the gates, it still wins. If he dies at Issus, it likely still wheels and crushes the Persian centre. The army was more than willing to continue in terms of that professionalism if Alexander went down. But the empire wasn't. The empire itself was held together by Alexander's existence, by his force of arms, yes, but by his cult of personality, by the fact that he was treated in many ways as a living god. And this is something he absolutely played up himself. So while the Alexandrian army may have been infallible, it may have been professional, it may have continued in a way that most people wouldn't expect an army of this period to, the moment Alexander went down, and as we saw in history, the Macedonian Empire's days were measured in months, not years, not decades. It was not going to last very long. And so that brings us to the final point. Was he brave and lucky, or was he talented? He was a very talented military commander, that is without a doubt, with a fair bit of luck backing him up. But in hindsight, I think it's fair to say he probably wasn't the best king, and he was pretty unlucky when it came to ruling as a king. Thank you all for joining me for this video today. I know it was pretty dense in information. Let me know if you enjoyed it and you enjoyed this kind of analysis sort of thing, over rather than just telling a series of historical events. So yeah, let me know, like, comment, make sure you subscribe to The Ancient Connection, and I will catch you all next time with something different. Not Roman. Probably. Maybe. 50-50. I'm 90% sure it's not Roman. Could be Roman adjacent. We'll find out.